My name is Robert Watt. I am the Communications Director at SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute, and it's my pleasure to be today's moderator. We're joined today by a fantastic panel of experts and experienced negotiators and policymakers from the field of environment, climate change, and trade. Today's session is going to try and address in quite a practical way issues about the what should be included, how should it be included, but also try and dig into issues around implementation and understand a little bit more about what the interests and architecture will need to be to make sure that countries, both from the north and south, can get on board. The session will be as much a dialogue with our audience as we can possibly make it, and we really encourage you to post questions using the platform, and I'll do my best to pick up those questions and put them to the panel. We're going to leave at least 20 to 25 minutes or so for that discussion, including your questions. This session is also part of a series of very interesting events during the course of the public forum this year that have been addressing questions around trade and environment, trade and climate change. And I hope that we'll be able to pick up some of those issues that have come up in sessions yesterday with the Permanent Mission of Costa Rica and the Permanent Mission of Canada, looking at similar questions. And to introduce our session today and to give us an understanding of really its context and why it matters so much, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce the State Secretary, Krista Nilsson, who is State Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Trade and Nordic Affairs of Sweden, Anna Hallberg. So, State Secretary, I give you the floor for an introductory keynote to set the scene for us. Over to you. Hello, Ola. Is the State Secretary there?
Yes, State Secretary is there. So let me just check if we can.
State Secretary Nilsson, it's a great pleasure to have you with us.
Hopefully you can hear me now, but I still want someone to allow me to start a video as well. Hopefully that will happen, but I think it's in the hands of the organizer. So, very good. Yeah, thank you so much, Robert, and sorry for that technical issues in the beginning. I'm very pleased to be a part of this panel, of course, and especially since I have a background being also a State Secretary of the Ministry of Environment many years ago in the 90s, where we started the international climate negotiations. So I have with me the experience of the climate negotiations also in the new role as State Secretary in the Ministry of Trade. And let me, as you said, say some words about the why, but I think the focus for the panel, and importantly, will be, as you said, on what will be the next steps and the possibilities ahead of us. I think it's very important now. We have the COP26 coming up, but also the ministerial meeting in the WTO. So we have the arenas, we have the opportunities, and now we should focus on discussing what can be achieved and why. And with the new IPCC report, of course, the urgency is there. It's even more clear than before. But it should also not be seen only as something we have to do, but also the possibilities and the opportunities. And I think there we have a nice link to the trade issue and what we can achieve. Today, the business sector see climate and sustainability as a part of the business model. And I think for us today, we must also see that the climate and the sustainability and the low carbon economy is a part of a welfare state. It's a way to create new jobs, to create great balances and reach for other goals of the society, while at the same time combating climate change. In the 19th, or since the 19th, in Sweden, we have made the decoupling between the CO2 emissions and the economic growth. We decreased the emissions by 24% at the same time as we tripled the GDP. So I think it's important to bear in mind that there is opportunities when we do this in the correct way. Now that has enabled us to have the vision of by 2045 being the first fossil-free welfare state, including sustainability and climate as a core of our political vision. But in order to reach the goals, we could not only work on a national level, we must see also how the trade system helps us and enables us to take the next steps and doing the transformation. And of course, in that regard, WTO also becomes very important. WTO and trade policy can and should play a very important role in creating scale for the sustainable solutions that we see today, the climate smart solutions that we see today. So international trade have the positive effect, and it makes the world a better place. But in order to enhance all these opportunities, we should focus on the global goals and also how to have an inclusive transition, looking into all the different parts of the society. And we, of course, see that the WTO needs to have a climate agenda, and that must be ambitious. And that is something that we hope that we today can discuss, and that will be also something we will work on creating results for the MC12. And one key element, of course, is to have in this declaration to liberalize the trade in climate-friendly goods and services. We see that the business sector and many parts of the society expect us to take that kind of steps, not decrease the different obstacles for enabling us to take all the opportunities that lies ahead. And I think, to your point, it's also important that we work to help all countries to gain access, and that is one very important element of why this is so important. All countries should gain the access of important technology and renewable energy, enabling countries to have more ambitious plans and national plans according to the Paris Agreement. And of course, this might be of great importance for the developing countries. So we see that this has to start with ambition climate agenda at the MC12, and that we could hamper the innovative business and transfer of technology. But it's when we aim to eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers for climate-friendly goods, that negotiations must start in the WTO and as soon as possible. Not creating a situation where the WTO is lagging behind, because now we see progressive decisions is taking in different multilateral fora. So I think it's very important for WTO to play its role, to build trust, to be modern, that we will be able to deliver on it. Another important issue, of course, is the fossil fuel subsidies. And Sweden strongly support the ongoing work within the WTO to on the fossil fuel subsidies reform. But we should also see that the green procurement, talking about the possibilities, that is very important as well, giving a clear signal of what should be used the public financing for. And of course, also the trade and export credit system. We have changed that in Sweden. We are now discussing with allies on how to make an international change in that way, and that is, of course, important. We will hear more about the National Board of Trade in Sweden that have made more focus on the what issues. And I think I'm looking forward to listening to a report from Emily and listening to discussion in order to increase the ambitions for the upcoming discussions between us and countries. So to summarize, I think we need the bold action. We have the possibilities, and it's something that is also creating economic development that is for all and could be and should be inclusive in that regard. And therefore, we should take a step away from the contradictions between working on climate and trade and economic growth. I think we have a good example, and I'm happy to follow the discussions and share some more of these views with you. So over to you, Robert, and thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, State Secretary, for setting the scene and again, also giving us the context of how important it is with MC12 just coming up to seize the moment and to ensure that we grasp the challenge and that WTO does set its climate agenda. I'm going to introduce our panel very briefly now, and we start off our panel with Emily Eriksson, who is a trade policy advisor at the National Board of Trade in Sweden. But we're also extremely happy and honoured to have Brett Longley with us, who is a senior policy advisor with over a decade of experience working on trade and environment issues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Zealand. And then also it's wonderful to have Dr. Claudia Mvula-Pollen with us, who is Centre Director at Cuts International Lusaka in Zambia. You're all very warmly welcome. We can't wait to hear your insights about this. First off, we're going to hear from Emily, who, as State Secretary Nilsson has just said, is going to tell us a little bit about a forthcoming report from the National Board of Trade of Sweden that looks into the what needs to be covered in an agreement to support the climate transition. So Emily, over to you. And I know that you've got a couple of slides to share with us. So why don't you go ahead and share those slides, and then the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert. It's a great honor being here today. I'll put forward my slides here with our key recommendations. So there you go. So in light of the climate crisis that we're all facing and the discussion among the WTO members ahead of MC12 and the COP26, we wanted to analyze what the WTO and its members could and should do to contribute in a meaningful way to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So in our forthcoming report, we analyze the possibilities for the WTO members to promote climate goals within a new trade agreement. The focus was on liberalization on goods, non-tariff measures, services, and disciplines to fossil fuel subsidies. We only considered climate mitigation and not other environmental issues. And this limitation should not be interpreted like other environmental issues are not important, but rather a way of limiting the scope of our analysis. In the report, we combine economic and legal analysis and provide policy recommendations on ways forward. We first look at what could be negotiated from a substantive point of view, and then we look at how any negotiated outcomes could be implemented in an agreement. So what did we find? So first, as tariff elimination for climate-friendly goods reduces the cost of mitigation action and promotes the spread of climate-friendly technology across borders, we recommend that negotiators aim for zero tariffs for as many climate-friendly goods and their production inputs as possible. To provide more detailed recommendations on categories of goods that could be included, we analyzed previous list of climate and environmental goods and made comparison with the mitigation options and technologies for different sectors that are listed in the 5th assessment reports by the IPCC. And our analysis revealed an extremely wide range of climate goods and inputs with potential for liberalization. However, we also found that several important mitigation technologies did not feature on the lists, and we therefore suggest 4 new categories or areas with potential to supplement categories used in previous lists of climate-friendly goods. Secondly, non-tariff barriers for goods should also be included in any negotiations to increase the economic and mitigation impact of an agreement. And our analysis highlights that there are several mechanisms available to facilitate trade in climate goods. For example, an agreement on mutual recognition of results of conformity assessment procedures for climate goods. Another example could be more commitments on harmonization with international standards relevant for the goods. And in addition to the liberalization of goods, services are also critical to promoting the dissemination of technologies and knowledge needed for the climate transition, both in their own right and as complements to climate goods. Therefore, as many others have recommended before us, negotiations on further market access openings for services relevant for greenhouse gas mitigation are vitally important. I don't have time to go into detail, but in our analysis, we find that there are a large number of climate relevant services that can be targeted for liberalization, and we therefore recommend that negotiators aim to include as many climate relevant services as possible. Finally, fossil fuel subsidies have detrimental climate effects and distort trade, and the phase out of such subsidies is almost certainly necessary to reach the Paris targets. As we have limited time to go through all the areas, I will just provide our main recommendation, and that is that as many of the fossil fuel subsidies that we consider to be inefficient as possible should be made forbidden in an agreement covering fossil fuel subsidies. An agreement can also be based on previous agreements within the WTO that discipline subsidies. Now, let us turn to the question on how to implement a negotiated outcome and the architecture of an agreement. So from a legal as well as an economic and political perspective, an agreement covering all the areas should ideally be designed as a multilateral agreement. However, bearing in mind the difficulties involving all the WTO members in a new agreement, we recommend negotiations on an Annex 4 agreement in accordance with Article 10, Paragraph 9 of the Marrakesh Agreement. And that is an agreement only creating rights and obligations for the parties, like, for example, the government procurement agreement. We consider that this alternative would have the highest potential to contribute to global climate action, since it could include comprehensive commitments and provisions on all the areas that I mentioned previously. Such an agreement would also, like a multilateral agreement, need a consensus from the entire membership. Due to the MFN principle, both participating WTO members as well as non-participating WTO members would benefit from climate goods and services liberalization and the lower cost of adjustments to a lower carbon economy. So for the climate's sake, we really hope that the entire WTO membership could let some members go ahead and agree on such an agreement. However, considering that consensus is a requirement for an Annex 4 agreement, another less ambitious but more realistic option could be to negotiate what we call the reference paper type agreement, like the information technology agreement or the telecom reference paper. And such an agreement could include tariff reductions and sectoral services commitments. But it's a bit unclear whether and to what extent such an agreement could also cover comprehensive rules on fossil fuel subsidies and further commitments on TBTs for climate goods. Therefore, yet another option could be to negotiate these more ambitious issues in, for example, an Annex 4 agreement, after or in parallel to a reference paper type agreement on tariff reductions and sectoral services commitments. In any case, in light of the urgency of the climate transition, we recommend a flexible and a pragmatic approach, implying that negotiations should start on all the issues as soon as possible, preferably at MC12, but that any outcomes could be implemented separately as soon as they are concluded. For the legal design of an agreement, we also consider various other issues, such as the need of a critical mass provision, the need of review clauses to update the list of goods and services, but also SDT provisions for developing countries. And why? First and foremost, the participation of developing countries is highly desirable from both a climate and development perspective. A majority of the WTO members are developing countries, and therefore we consider that negotiators should, for example, consider capacity building and support for developing countries to identify climate goods and services relevant to their interests. In addition, we find the SDT approach adopted in the Trade Facilitation Agreement highly relevant for all the areas that we discuss in the report. With such an approach, some commitments could be conditioned upon and depend on technical assistance for the developing countries. For a more in-depth account, you will have to read our report, which will be available on our website in the coming months. You have the link there. To conclude, to ensure that trade and trade policy contribute to reaching the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, we recommend that WTO members launch ambitious and inclusive negotiations at MC12 on fossil fuel subsidy reform and on liberalization trade in climate goods and services, including technical barriers to trade. A launch of negotiations on climate relevant issues at the MC12 and a prompt conclusion of negotiations could also restore confidence in the WTO and show that the WTO is highly relevant and able to work on important matters for future generations. In the IPCC's newly released sixth climate report, it was also confirmed that the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement will not be reached unless immediate and drastic moves to cut greenhouse gas emissions are made. We consider that it's time to take action.
Thank you very much, Emily, for that presentation, which I think really gives us a very good picture of what needs to be covered, but also some hints about some quite technical but very important issues about how it would be achieved. And we wanted to complement this assessment, and thanks for the preview of this report, with the experience of and lessons learned, if you like, that we can gain from listening to Brett, who's going to talk about the ACTS work that is led, that New Zealand has spearheaded. So Brett, the floor is yours to give us some of those lessons learned of what you've been working on through the ACTS process.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thanks to the WTO Secretariat and the Swedish National Board of Trade for organising this event, and also to my fellow panellists and the audience. Well, Emily's just highlighted some key elements of a potential agreement and the options that we might consider for its legal design and the content. So I want to focus my remarks, and as you noted, Robert, on an example of a plurilateral trade and climate change agreement that's currently in progress, the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or the ACTS agreement. So I'll outline the origin and rationale for the initiative, describe briefly the main elements, provide an update on the state of play with the negotiations, and then some lessons learned. So first of all, on the origin and rationale, in formulating the proposal, New Zealand's thinking was shaped by three considerations. First, while trade policy is not the silver bullet for addressing climate change, it does have an important and practical role to play, as we heard from Emily, and the State Secretary, Nielsen. It can be particularly helpful to incentivize the uptake of cleaner technologies and to help level the playing field. These are both points that Emily's just made. The second consideration was that COVID-19 has increased the urgency of the trade and environment challenge as countries implement a suite of economic recovery policies, some of which risk locking in emissions-intensive technologies for many years to come. And the third consideration is that while the Marrakesh Agreement puts sustainable development at the heart of the WTO mandate, it has proved difficult to get 164 members to agree on how to give effect to this. While a multilateral outcome remains the first best option and is a priority for New Zealand, the reality is that more than 20 years after the Doha round, we're still trying to conclude fisheries subsidies negotiations, and efforts to achieve an outcome on environmental goods recently did not come to fruition. So we should not underestimate the challenge here. For these reasons, New Zealand looked for partners who were ready to go further, faster, and to lead the way to show others what can be achieved and thereby inspire multilateral action. New Zealand, together with a group of diverse but similarly ambitious partners, Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway, and Switzerland, decided to progress negotiations toward a plurilateral agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. The negotiations were launched by Prime Minister Ardern and her counterparts at the UN General Assembly in late 2019. So turning now to the agreement, the Act has 4 components: environmental goods, environmental services, fossil fuel subsidies, and voluntary eco-labelling and institutional mechanisms. The environmental goods element aims to incentivize the uptake of environmental goods and new technologies by eliminating tariffs on a list of goods that have identifiable and sound environmental end uses or benefits. The environmental services element will identify a modernized list of services that goes beyond the existing scope of the CPC 94 and captures the expansive and innovative environmental services sector. The eco-labelling element will establish guidelines to inform the development and implementation of voluntary eco-labelling programs, and will also create mechanisms to support the application of guidelines and provide an avenue for cooperation and collaboration. And then finally, the fossil fuel subsidies element aims to establish legally binding disciplines to eliminate harmful fossil fuel subsidies. This aligns with the direction set out by leaders in the Sustainable Development Goal 12, Part C, for the rationalisation and phase out of harmful fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. Turning now to the state of play with the negotiations. 6 rounds have taken place, starting in June 2020. The most recent one just concluded in September. All have been conducted on a virtual basis, and negotiations have now advanced to the point where discussions are occurring on consolidated text proposals. The group is working to develop a list of environmental goods for tariff elimination, drawing on discussions and resources from other fora, including APEC and the Environmental Goods Agreement. Work on the services element is focused on services that increase the output and efficiency of environmental goods and infrastructure to help move the world towards greener technologies and methods of operation. The group's currently looking at how to assess which services should be included. And then New Zealand, on behalf of the Act's countries, regularly updates the WTO, the Committee on Trade and Environment, and the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Dialogue, as well as other processes such as in APEC. What are some of the lessons learned? Well, the negotiations are still a work in progress, so the lessons learned are preliminary, but 3 points are worth noting. First, on participation. The Act has a broad regional spread: Central America, Pacific, Europe, and the mix of developing and developed countries ensures a wide range of perspectives inform the discussions, including those of energy producers and consumers, and those with concerns about energy security. The second element is on information. We want an outcome that works for developing and developed countries, but not everyone starts with the same information. So an early part of the process has been to ensure that everyone has access to the same information. For example, information about what has already been done on environmental goods and services and on fossil fuel subsidy reform in APEC, in the G7 and the G20. Finally, on negotiations, this is the first time for all participants that they've negotiated a trade agreement virtually. All negotiating rounds have been online. And while it's clear that in-person meetings have particular benefits, one advantage of virtual meetings is they allow more people to participate. And this can help build capacity and capability. Another feature is the ability to build a positive dynamic. The outcome will be a trade agreement, but the process is collegial rather than competitive, with all working towards a common goal. And then finally, to make a point that the next panelist, Claudia, will expand on, to help build an inclusive approach, developing countries lead the development discussions. So their perspectives are an integral part of the negotiations. And one way this has been done is through the use of non-papers. So to conclude, the Act is designed to be a living agreement, which means that the scope could be widened in the future with new topics added. It will be open to any other WTO member who wants to join and can meet the commitments. When negotiations were launched, leaders were clear that the aim is to demonstrate in a concrete and substantive manner how trade measures and trade policy can support climate and environmental objectives and provide momentum towards an eventual multilateral outcome. So the aim is to develop a pathfinder agreement that could eventually lead to a multilateral outcome, and hence it's intended to be supportive of multilateral rules and institutions. Thank you very much. Back to you, Robert.
Brett, thank you very much for that presentation. I'll hand directly over to Claudia, who's going to pick up points that you've made, Brett, but also that we've heard from all of our other speakers, which is about the importance of understanding the perspective, the interests, and the priorities of developing countries when it comes to moving ahead in the area of WTO and climate change. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Nielsen, for your presentation. Mine is going to be focused more on some of the domestic challenges that are going to prevent some of these recommendations that have been made. So I'm starting from a point of view of just looking at how incoherent some of these climate trajectories have been on the less developing countries. More especially by bringing out, the different trajectories that are being proposed by the donors, advisors, and governments on one hand, who tend to support high carbon-led growth as a route away from aid dependency and toward middle income status. On the other hand, there's also a pronouncement that there's need for low carbon, pro-poor, and climate resilient development in the face of increasing climate risk. Now, the problem is that this incoherence or mismatch that is resulting between high carbon and low carbon strategies actually constitutes as a major challenge for a clear path, considering what should be the most efficient trade and environmental considerations. A good example is that coal and oil and gas firms have received $3.8 trillion in finance since the Paris deal in 2015. Now, this shows that financing of fossil fuels is on the rise. This is quite regressive as carbon emissions, especially impact on the environment, and will be borne by the most vulnerable groups, which are mostly women and the youth. And then, of course, compounding some of this is related to the notions that most of these less developing countries or sub-Saharan African countries are standing on. Most African countries or LDCs are actually of the view that trade and environmental issues should not be linked at the WTO level. And this is kind of coming from a point of view that environmental issues, once linked to trade, will sort of penalize LDCs, because LDCs already are unable to invest in environmental standards and environmental goods and services. Even if they were subsidized, they will not be affordable, or because of the many priorities in terms of the competing needs that LDCs have in the face of limited fiscal expenditure. And of course, this fiscal expenditure, the limited fiscal expenditure that LDCs or less developing countries are experiencing is mostly compounded by external debt stock that has arisen, for example, from $296 billion in 2010 to $625 billion. Zambia, for example, as debt stands at approximately $23.5 billion. Now, this has a huge bearing in terms of meeting environmental commitments towards the Sustainable Development Goals and even the Paris Agreement. But more importantly, the low carbon norms are also facing stiff headwinds given bottlenecks that are related to, example, problems with regards to access to finance. And also there are warning signs that these low carbon climate resilient initiatives are largely led by development partners. And of course, there's lack of institutionalization and coherence within government structures and policies and processes within the less developing countries. And of course, there's also trade-offs that are being negotiated between high carbon and low carbon development strategies. But it's also important to remember that in the midst of all this preoccupation with making these commitments to the Paris Agreement, the LDCs are preoccupied with their desire to attain middle income status and semi-industrialized status. And this obviously contradicts some commitments around the implementation of SDG 7 to be carried out, as well as being able to meet these nationally determined goals that were made towards the Paris Agreement. But then how does a sound approach to climate transition look like for less developing countries or from an African perspective? So there's need, of course, to promote an African agenda with a view to develop common views and submissions that can be shared on multiple platforms. Now, if you must know, one of the key things is that adaptation is a core focus area for Africa and must be accompanied by accelerated adaptation finance and equalize flows between regions and even vulnerable groups. Our United Nations environmental program has actually committed to giving developing countries about $70 billion annually to adapt to climate change, and a further commitment of 140 to 300 billion by 2030. But in 2019, Africa had a 15 billion funding gap, but adaptation again only gets 20% of the global climate finance. So developing countries get only about 2/3 of the climate finance. Of the 30 billion African government investments in adaptation, only 1.6% goes towards the private sector. This tells you that there's a serious gap as far as countries investing in environmental goods and services. So another focus area could be, a focus on nature-based solutions across multilateral treaties. And so far, most African countries have indeed included these nature-based solutions. And some of the negotiating points include expansion of protected areas, blue carbon ecosystems, and of course, there's need for more guidance on addressing these nature-based solutions. Another key element is the spatial and differential treatment that has been outlined as essential for LDC inclusion in the WTO trading regime, which must be followed by strategic complementary technical support, meeting unique needs of developing countries, especially those with small administrations, to successfully integrate into the trading regime. But aside from this is the need to recognize that there is a digital divide currently preventing many of these developing countries to effectively apply environmental goods and services. Countries also need data and analysis to support decision-making and capacity building. And I think the global environmental facility support to countries for convention-related reporting and assessments such as national communications and biannual update reports is becoming increasingly important. And lastly, e-commerce that disables countries from effectively making use of environmental goods and services must be prioritized. Hence, cooperation on a multilateral level may present itself as an optimal way to go for aid for trade, being a crucial tool in order to maximize trade's contribution to sustainability. And more importantly, it will be important to trace the initiatives by prominent actors, mapping the network of power, how different actors are even influencing energy reforms across the developing countries. So Robert, I'll turn it over to you. I think these are the key interventions I wanted to make regarding some of the issues that might prevent, some of the recommendations that were being made linking trade and environment at the WTO.
Claudia, thank you very much, and I'm really grateful for you quite, starkly setting out the priorities and the context for many developing countries and how they see the WTO as needing really to focus on issues to ensure inclusive and sustainable development in the first instance. I'd like to just remind our audience that we really look forward to having a dialogue with you and hearing your questions, which I will take forward from the moderator's platform here and pose to the panel. And in fact, I'd like to start with one question here, because, and this really, it goes perhaps to anyone on the panel who wishes to answer it, but perhaps I can ask it to Claudia first of all. I mean, you were talking quite a lot about the view of developing countries, but what about the importance of including the big polluters? How do we include big polluters when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions, to make sure that this agreement, any agreement, would be actually as efficient as possible? Are there things that you think need to be done to make sure those big polluters, those big emitters of carbon dioxide are brought on board?
Definitely. I think a lot of it has to do with recognizing the power that these big polluters have, even as they are coming in the less developing country context, because initially, I think it has a lot to do with how far can less developing countries hold these big polluters accountable, if indeed the power balance lies on the other end. So I think this way it becomes important to create harmonize certain standards at an international level that will be able to penalize some of these big polluters without necessarily leaning on a small administration to hold them that much accountable, because I think the power balance still leans to the big polluters. They do have the resources and they have the legal system with which they can manipulate. So I think there has to be that kind of harmonization in terms of standards and creating those standards at an international level that will be able to enforce and be able to hold these big polluters accountable.
Thanks very much, Claudia. If anyone else on the panel wants to jump in on that question, then please do. Otherwise, I'm going to ask a question of Brett, actually. Brett, there's a lot of interest, I think, in the ACTS approach as this pioneer in this space. And I think there's going to be a lot of interest in how you're dealing with environmental services in these discussions. Can you talk a little bit more about the scope that you're envisaging for environmental services under ACTS?
Look, thanks, Robert. And yes, you're correct that it is an important issue. This is one of the areas, the environmental goods side of things is perhaps a little more straightforward because they're easier to identify. The services, as I think Emily might have noted, is more challenging, partly because we're starting from less comprehensive information base. So there's the way that's being addressed at the moment is very much on a bottom-up basis, that getting the participants to nominate their ideas about services. And as I mentioned, it was one of the current work elements is to try and get a better sense of how to assess which services should be included. So there's an early part of this is, if you like, a set of criteria by which we can assess when services are nominated. How do you then make an assessment to determine whether they should be included or not? But it is still very much, as I mentioned, a work in progress. So we still have some way to go on this. But again, happy to keep anyone who's interested, happy to keep them updated if they'd like that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brett. Perhaps I can turn to Emily and talk about the other side, the environmental goods, because Emily, you mentioned that there are some new categories and areas of goods that you're looking at in your study, which might complement the categories used in previous lists of climate-friendly goods. Can you tell us a little bit more about those new categories that you've identified?
Yes, I'm happy to do so. So the 4 new categories or areas with potential to supplement categories used in previous lists of climate-friendly goods would be climate infrastructure, technologies to support behavioral change, and technologies relevant for circular economy, and technologies relevant for agriculture, land, and forest management. I'm happy to go back to the other question about the big polluters as well, if I may, or the need or desirability to have them on board in a possible new agreement. So we consider this like within the scope of the need of a critical mass provisions that you usually have in trade agreements. So in our report, we chose to focus on the climate perspective, and from a climate perspective, a negotiated agreement on goods and services would have the largest effect if the biggest greenhouse gas emitters and major trading partners of goods and services would be included in the agreement and take part. So a critical mass provision could therefore increase the climate impact of an agreement. But nevertheless, even without a critical mass provision, participating WTO members would benefit from lower tariffs on climate goods and services, and which would lower the cost of adjustments to a low carbon economy. So therefore, we consider that the WTO members interested in negotiating tariffs reductions on climate relevant goods and services should not be deterred if 1 or 2 of the largest players do not participate. And for the same reason, we don't consider that it is necessary to include a critical mass provision. On the other hand, on an agreement on fossil fuel subsidies, the benefits from some form of critical mass provision could be stronger. And this is due to the fact that emission savings from unilateral action or a limited plurilateral phase out of fossil fuel subsidies could be limited by carbon leakage, which is when companies would move to countries with less ambitious environmental or climate standards. So the climate benefits of an agreement covering fossil fuel subsidies would increase as more of the major trading nations that heavily subsidize fossil fuels would participate.
Thanks very much, Emily, for setting that out for us about critical mass and where it really matters in different issues here. Can I follow that up actually with a question again to you about whether in your view, a WTO member that's interested in participating in negotiations on one issue, whether that's fossil fuel subsidies or something else, do you believe that they'll need to participate in negotiation on all areas, or do you see a sort of differential approach working here?
No, we don't think so. It's probably good if it's not included.
So I'd like to actually ask a question here to Brett, but it's perhaps going to open up to others, because I think one of the other reasons why it's so urgent for us to address the climate change within WTO is not only, of course, because of the huge risks that are being set out by the IPCC in their recent reports, or as Brett pointed out, the fact that the pandemic recovery runs the risk of locking us into higher carbon emissions, but also because there are policy movements taking place. And one of those big ones is carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And I wanted to ask Brett in the first instance about whether the work in the ACTS approach is looking at carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or how it will deal with a carbon border adjustment.
Yes, look, thanks, Robert. The short answer is no. The current scope of the Acts has been fairly deliberately confined to issues where we judged were most likely to succeed in getting an agreement off the ground. But the question of carbon border adjustments is by no means ruled out in the longer term. As I mentioned, the agreement's designed to be open not just to other members or other WTO members, but to other topics and other issues. For New Zealand's part, at the moment, we are watching with great interest what's happening in the European Union with the development of their carbon border adjustment mechanism, and also keeping abreast of developments or thinking in other countries that have also expressed not necessarily an interest, but have raised the issue internationally as well. In Canada, United States, as examples. But the carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think Emily had mentioned the issue, the risks around carbon leakage as countries, well, depending on the nature of their climate policies, as they introduce carbon prices into their economies, then that raises the question of carbon leakage. So that, and as we're trying to address climate change through the use of new technologies, liberalising trade in goods and services, through removing the distortions that fossil fuel subsidies introduce, then the playing field, if you like, could easily, I think, be perhaps, if there's progress on the goods and services side and the fossil fuel subsidies side, it would potentially focus attention much more on other tools that are being used to try and keep the playing field level. And again, carbon border adjustments are one such tool. So short answer, it's not part of the ACT discussion at the moment, but it's by no means ruled out, and there's a very active interest. We're maintaining a very active interest in how that those proposals are being developed. Thank you.
Thanks, Brett. Claudia, we heard State Secretary Nielsen talking about the importance of making sure that developing countries have access to technology, especially, for example, renewable technology for renewable energy. I'm just wondering whether you've got any thoughts you can share about how the MC12 and in the longer term, broader discussions in the WTO could actually facilitate that access to technology. Are there things that should be done? Because you've also highlighted that is such a crucial part of ensuring low carbon development plans for developing countries.
I think I have noted quite clearly that part of it, when you look at what is being invested even in the private sector, it's only 1.6 billion. So it tells you that there's a lot of capacity building that is required if indeed developing countries are if you're going to follow this trajectory of inclusivity. I mean, not just even for the countries that are just starting up that are looking promising, there's still a lot of fiscal limitations in terms of how much they can invest. And so I think the entry point is not only just technical expertise, but also to reduce the digital divide, because the digital divide is seriously affecting this inclusivity of less developing countries. And I think that will require, obviously, case by case for the different countries, depending on what is unique to them. And so this will require some kind of intentional efforts by, in terms of trying to establish what areas would be most beneficial for the different countries based on their unique needs.
Thanks very much, Claudia. I've got another question here to you, actually. Would the LDCs and developing countries benefit from tariff reductions on environmental goods? And if so, which ones?
I think that's that's the argument that we're just talking about. It sounds all grand when we talk about, a reduction of tariffs on environmental goods. It seems as if once there's that reduction, automatically developing countries will get on board. But I mean, there's so many domestic regulatory issues that need attention that sometimes it becomes quite difficult to really see where environmental concerns really where they are in terms of priority when it comes to budgeting processes and even the actual implementation. So when it comes to maybe the kind of environmental goods, it would have to be in the agricultural sector. Right now, at the moment, there's need for more enhanced GIS systems. And because there's limited insurance, and so if there's more investment in GIS systems, this is going to help, obviously, will have a bearing in terms of sustainable food systems. And obviously, when we talk about all the droughts and all that, we'll be able to make a more meaningful impact. So I think that is a specific area that would be most interesting, or at least a priority for most of the developing countries.
Thanks very much.
Robert, can I make just a short comment there, that one of the issues that's been brought to our attention in relation to tariff reductions is that some developing countries still rely on income from tariffs as an important part of their, get the government financing. So there's a kind of balance to be struck, or a consideration there as well. If they lose that income, then it might, on one hand, encourage the flow of new technologies and new goods in, but then they've got to be able to have the capacity, the financial capacity as well, to actually use those and implement them. So that's another challenge, I think, that's part of this mix.
Well put, Brett. I think that's, Claudia was implying that when she was talking about LDC seeing this as penalising their development in some way.
Yeah.
I know that Secretary Nisson's raised his hand. I was absolutely hoping to give him the floor, because I would love him to say something to reflect on what he's heard, but also perhaps to tell us what he thinks the minimum is to ensure that these discussions can move ahead and give direction at MC12 and in the ministerial declaration. Floor's yours, Secretary Nisson.
Thank you so much, Robert. And I think there is much of interest that has been said and inspiring when we move towards the MC12, of course. And let me start by a reflection. You said, Brett, talking about further, faster, but I think what we also have discussed is that it should be for all. Also talking about the inclusive perspective, the developing countries, but also in the coherent way. I think there is a couple of points that the negotiations must be inclusive. It must be a broad perspective of countries to bring the negotiations forward. It should be both the developed and the developing countries, of course. I think also we can say that knowledge exists as a starting point. What we've done, as Emily said, is to complement in some ways, but knowledge definitely exists. And there is a leadership needed. And I think that's also to your question, Robert, that what we see as a minimum level is that we have a very clear decision on starting the negotiations, putting out the expectations for what will come after. I don't think that we will have maybe the final conclusions to the MT12, but at least the agenda, the roadmap, the ambitions moving forward. And I think to Claudia's perspective, also the coherence is important. And I mentioned that trade system and what we do in trade policy is of course important, but I also mentioned the export financing system that we are working with as government. And of course, when we talk about the WTO, that's one scope, but for sure, you're totally right that we should include all the different mechanisms that are talking about financing. So I think the export financing system that we have ongoing discussions now is very important as well. And for the Swedish government, yesterday we took a large decision on how to include more of the climate focus in our development programs for, as you said, going forward, discussing together individually with countries what is needed and what is the possibilities. So I think there are several reflections that I do from this discussion that shows that we need to have a holistic perspective, but the WTO is definitely one part and should take bold decisions. And maybe the final word I also noted was the capacity building, because I think that's, to your point, is something that we should work on, including more seeing how to transform the different economies in a very good way. And maybe final comment is that otherwise, if we don't do this, if we don't manage to move ahead, I think there is an ongoing transformation in the economies in several countries. And what we are talking about now is to make that more a part of the general global development as well. The risk is that we have a diversification of what is happening in different economies otherwise. So I think this is a very important part of not ending up in more different economies, low and high carbon economies. So that is my reflections, and thank you so much for all the comments.
Thank you very much, State Secretary, with a fantastic summary of many of the key points raised during these discussions. And to end there with the importance of having an inclusive and just transition when it comes to thinking about the role of the WTO is a great way to end. I leave you with perhaps one other vision, which is to looking beyond MC12 to 2023 and the global stock take within the UNFCCC. Wouldn't it be fantastic if that global stock take was reaching new levels of ambition, because things like fossil fuel subsidies and the easy and equal access to renewable energy technologies was really taking off and was aided by the work of WTO and the sort of financing mechanisms, export credit financing that State Secretary Nilsson mentioned there. That would be fantastic to think about what contribution trade can make by 2023 in that global stock take. Thank you very much to all of our panelists today. It's been a really rich discussion and I've enjoyed it very much. I hope that you in the audience have also enjoyed this. And with that, I thank you and wish you a very good day.